Hello, this is a presentation about the revised ISO standard for IT asset management processes called ISO IEC 19770-1 2017. It was published in December of 2017. My name is David Bickett, and I was a co-editor of the standard. The overall project editor was Yoshinori Takahashi of Japan, and Jintaro Shinoda was a co-editor with me. The purpose of this presentation is stated on this slide. It's to explain the standard to SAM and ITAM professionals and anyone else interested. It does this by providing context and more detail than is available from the ISO preview. The context that we need to cover includes why we want such a standard and how it relates to other standards. This is the contents of the presentation. I'm not going to go through that because we'll be going through it as we do the presentation. This is a diagrammatic overview of the ISO ITAM standard. But to really understand it and how it relates to other standards, we need to cover some other material first. First, let's be clear about what we mean by a process standard. It's a specification of the processes for a functional area. There are various ways of specifying a process standard, but the ISO way of specifying a management system standard is the one which is most important in the marketplace. Let's also consider why we should have a process standard. The more generic reasons are for industry standardization and interoperability, such as for the reasons shown here. But the holy grail for most ITAM practitioners is to provide a basis for independent certification, to demonstrate to others that your capabilities meet that standard. It will help to explain a bit more about ISO's management system standards, the ISO way of defining a process standard, the main ISO way. Please note that both 27001 for information security management and the ISO ITAM standard are management system standards, and they use what's called the Annex SL text now to dictate what the high-level structure is and some common wording that has to be used in all such standards. Everything that's a management system standard that's been developed since around 2013 has to conform with this. 20,000-1, which many of you will be familiar with for IT service management, is also currently being rewritten to be in that form. They all look the same way at the top. The differences are in the detail by means of additions. We already have considered why we want a process standard in general. Let's now consider why we specifically want one which is an ISO management system standard. Firstly, it will result in alignment with all such management system standards, which will simply help the whole process of understanding and working together. Very specifically, it's been designed so that we have more alignment and integration with security and with service management. We expect as a result to have more uptake of the standard, and in any case, ISO requires it for what we're doing. This slide gives some examples of management system standards. If you've implemented any of these in your organization, you should have already a mindset, shall we say, of dealing with things in the way that we're dealing with them now with the revised -1 standard. There is a much longer list which you can look at, some 68 or 78 standards which are listed on the ISO website. You can see the reference to that at the end of this presentation. Let's work through the high-level structure for all ISO management system standards using this new approach. The first 4 lines there, introduction through terms and definitions, are fairly standard, and they don't really affect the content of the standard itself. The real standard starts with section 4, which is context of the organization. You have the first one, 4.1, understanding the organization and its context. That basically means understanding the opportunities and the risks for the organization. 4.2, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties means understanding what your shareholders or owners expect or require. Likewise, your employees and other stakeholders, which includes, for example, software publishers, and in general, all of your partners, your business relationships. They all are stakeholders effectively in your organization. They may not impose absolute requirements, but they nonetheless often need to be taken into account. The 4.3 is determining your scope, and 4.4 is defining it. 5 concerns the requirements for leadership. I'm not going to walk through that in detail, but what I would say in summary for this page is that 4 and 5 are largely the same for all management system standards. There will be tweakings in there. For example, in our standard, we make it clear that the stakeholders for your management system standard do include your software publishers, and therefore the terms and conditions that you've got in your software licensing agreements. But otherwise, in general, these are going to be extremely similar between all the different management system standards. If we now go into clause 6, we see that this deals with planning. We'll be looking at this in more detail with the review that we do later for the ISO ITAM standard itself. Clause 7 is for support functions. Most of these are self-explanatory with the exception of 7.5, documented information. This is effectively auditable records. What do you need to document? In general, in the past, management system standards have had a reputation of wanting excessive documentation, and what they've tried to do with this new approach is to greatly reduce the amount of documentation which is required compared to earlier approaches, at least. If we go on to clause 8 for operations, that's where we expect to have most detail added by most management system standards, and therefore the most differences between the different standards. Excuse me. We'll obviously be looking at this in more detail in terms of our own standard, and then performance evaluation and improvement, again, are reasonably standard across all management system standards. Just a couple of quick comments. It is a huge improvement over what's happened in the past, and it's particularly improvement for the ISO ITAM standard to be using this approach because it's going to give us so much commonality with all the other major standards of this type. However, it still won't be perfect. You can't tell anything about the standard unless you do a deep dive. The top level doesn't tell you anything different about them. And likewise, the clauses in different standards can have significant additions, so there is still differentiation at the lower levels that you have to deal with. Let's now consider the issue of physical asset management compared with IT asset management. It's a very practical issue in terms of the standard itself, so we need to understand it. By physical asset management, we generally mean management of major capital assets, such as, say, electric generating equipment, water treatment facilities, major manufacturing equipment, mining equipment, and similar. But there's still much in common between physical asset management and IT asset management. What we did was we wrote the ISO ITAM standard using most of the base text from the physical asset management standard and then added things for software in particular. I'm going to give some detailed observations here. They may sound highly technical, but they're actually very important in certain specific situations and in particular for dealing with ISO. Technically, 19770-1 is a discipline-specific extension of 55001, but with changes. They both have the same management system standard headings and common text. One thing very important to note is that the ISO ITAM standard is not a sector-specific application of 55001. If it were, it would have some very bad implications for us. Conformance with the ISO ITAM standard does not mean conformance with 55001 because of some very small differences, although achieving 55001 conformance should be easy. The extensions, the things that have been added, are primarily to deal with software and licensing. They also provide for a concept of tiers, which we'll discuss a bit later. The most significant change from 55001 is in risk management. We've taken the risk management approach from 27001. And in any case, all these changes are detailed in Annex D to the new standard. Why do we need these extensions? Primarily because of the characteristics of software, difficulty of controlling, the complexity, the licensing issues. The points listed on the slide are all reasonably self-explanatory, except for perhaps the flexibility of location point. By this we mean the fact that software may be stored or installed in one location, but accessed or used from additional instances or locations. For example, using virtual machines for cloud-based services such as SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS, and generally via network access to server-based software. Having said why we need the extensions, well then, what is the nature of those extensions? And that's what this slide gives. And likewise, there's some further explanation of this in the introduction to the ISO ITAM standard. Number one, we need controls over software modification, duplication, and distribution. We need audit trails of authorizations and changes made to IT assets. We need control over licensing and all aspects of that licensing. We need control over situations with mixed ownership and responsibilities. We're talking now especially cloud computing, bring your own device, and things like that. We also, assuming that it's justified for business value, to be able to reconcile your IT asset management data with other systems, such as for financial information systems. This diagram gives the conceptual overview of the entire standard. It's not from the standard itself, but from the ITIL guide to software and IT asset management, which was published in January of 2018, on which I'm a co-author. There are three groupings of processes on here. The top ones are the ones that are common to all management system standards. They're called management system processes for IT asset management. I'm not going to go through them in detail. We effectively go through them when we go through the parts of the common ISO clauses for management system standards. The second grouping here, functional management processes for IT assets, these are specific to ITAM. And we'll be going through these a little bit further, but that's one grouping. And likewise, the lifecycle management processes for IT assets, those are specific to the IT asset management standard. These groupings are further divided into tiers, and I need to explain a bit more about tiers to cover that. This is the grouping of tiers, or rather the grouping of processes, which have been created for use with the standard. tiers were introduced in the 2012 edition of the standard. That was edition 2, in response to market feedback that organizations wanted something which met the most critical requirements for trustworthy data and license compliance, but they didn't want to have to comply or implement all the other processes fully. Edition 3 has kept that concept. The 3 tiers we have in edition 3 are trustworthy data, which basically includes the data for license compliance. The life cycles are dealt with in tier 2, life cycle processes, and the remaining functional processes are dealt with in the 3rd tier, which we call optimization. We need to emphasize that these are only suggested groupings of processes. They are chosen from Annex A. You can choose other groupings if you want. You can add additional processes if you want. For example, if you're having to deal with environmental issues. But in general, the strong recommendation is to use these tier groupings for their understandability in the industry. The tier 1 objectives are already included in the main standard itself. We call that tier trustworthy data. It includes, as it says here, change management, data management, license management, and security management. The 2nd and 3rd tiers are ones that can be added. They're intended to be cumulative. Going back to the diagram now, we can see how those tiers are represented here. The top tier, the one for, not tier, but rather the top grouping of these processes are always in every management system standard. So we're not talking about those in terms of tiers. In terms of tiers, we're talking about this grouping, the first one shown, which we call trustworthy data. You have to implement these 4 processes in the box, and we just listed those on the last slide. They're included in the main text, which means that they always have to be carried out. The ones, however, which are crossed out on this diagram do not have to be implemented in the base standard. If we move on to the 2nd tier, that's when we add the processes in that lower box. You can see what they include there. They include specification, that includes sub-processes such as requesting, analysis, design, and evaluation. You have development, you have acquisition, you have release, you have deployment, operation, and retirement. I would just note that the service management standard combines release and deployment. However, we've got them separated because release and deployment are not typically performed together, especially in mass or high volume situations where you may release something once, but it then can be deployed, say, on customer or end user request as requested. Moving on to tier 3, that is the 4 boxes shown: relationship and contract management, financial management, service level management, and other risk management. I'd now like to quickly go through the table of contents of the ISO ITAM standard so you can see how all of this fits together. We're using the MSS high-level structure here. Anything that is required by ISO is in black. Those things which were added by the generic or the physical asset management standard 55001 are in green. The things which we've added in the ITAM standard are in red. The first additions there under scope aren't significant other than explanatory, really. And again, under context of the organization and leadership, you can see that the additions in principle are fairly minimal. When we get into clause 6, planning, that's where we start to see significant IT-specific additions. 6.1.2 and 6.1.3 are the way we address risk, which is the same way as it's addressed in principle in 27001 for information security management. Likewise, 6.2.1 and 6.2.2 are the ones where we introduce tiers. What we do in 6.2.1 is that you decide what processes you want to have covered by your management system. In 6.2.2, you then take the objectives for those processes, and in 6.2.3, you combine those objectives with any other objectives which have already been established or additional ones you have. And that, therefore, is the set of objectives which drives your overall management system. If we go on to section 7 or clause 7, which is for support, you see two sets of additions. Number one, 7.5 information requirements has been added by 55001, but that's just as relevant for us to determine clearly what your information requirements are. We've added under general about documented information. We're talking about auditable information. We're saying we've given additional requirements for the traceability of ownership and responsibility, and likewise to have audit trails for authorizations and the execution of authorizations. Going on to clause 8 for operation. This is where we get into the real meat, and you'll find differences between all the standards, almost all the standards in this area, significant differences. 8.2 is already management of change. It's included in the text of what's required by ISO for all management system standards, but it's not labeled as a specific function. It was made a specific function and needs to be a specific function in 55001. We then add the rest of tier 1 processes into clause 8 directly: core data management, license management, and security management. 8.6, it just says other processes, but that's where you add all the processes for tiers 2 and 3 and anything else your organization may wish to have in it. We've added two further subclauses here. One covers outsourcing and services. They already had a section on outsourcing in 55001. We've expanded that and made it clear that it covers services as well. We've also addressed specifically this question of mixed responsibilities in 8.8. Clause 9 is pretty much standard. We go on to clause 10 then. That clause 10 is pretty much standard, although 55001 added a subclause for preventive action. The annexes are all specific to to the ISO ITAM standard. The first one is the most important one that lists all of the processes and objectives, both for tiers, for tiers 1, 2, and 3. Annex B explains the IT asset management tiers. Annex C gives a more detailed explanation of the characteristics of IT assets, and D gives a detailed list of all the changes from ISO 55001. Many of which were to ensure absolute compliance down to the letter and punctuation with Annex SL from ISO. Organizational certification is something which is very important for many people. In editions 1 and 2, it was a difficult approach to use because it was required that we did it using outcomes, which was what SC7, that's the parent body over WG21, required at the time it was written. Nonetheless, quite a few organizations were certified, and there's a blog post that I've done which goes into a lot of that. Edition 3 is one which is going to be much more suitable for certification. Any management system standard auditor should be capable of certifying that, especially those which certify against 27001, the Information Security Management Standard, because there are a lot of those. There's actually a separate presentation on the close links between 27001 and the ISO ITAM standard, and that goes into some of these certification issues as well. Nonetheless, you will need to have subject matter expertise, and organizations like that can subcontract that in as required. If any of you watching this would like to get more involved in ISO activities, it's quite possible to do that. You can get involved through the national bodies, national standards bodies, and also through liaison bodies, and some of those are listed there. I leave that for you to follow up if you wish. In terms of obtaining the standard, this just gives a list of some of the places where you can get it and the cost. It's a trivial cost compared to what you normally spend in your organization, even for one piece of software. Often very trivial compared to that, but nonetheless, that's the way it is if we want to be in this world. There are quite a few additional resources you can access. There's a free preview which includes much of the standard, but not the so-called normative sections. You can also get the standard, which gives the overview and terminology, which is a freely available standard, and that shows where you can get it. There's a Wikipedia entry. I have some more information on my own website, and you can download a comprehensive list of 78 management system standards, and it shows where you can get those. There's also quite a bit of additional information on my own website beyond those blogs. There's a frequently asked questions sheet. There's a short tutorial for SAM and ITAM practitioners on management system standards of the ISO variety. This presentation is there, the video that goes with it, the presentation on how to use ISO ITAM and ISO Information Security Management together is there, plus the video. And there are links to the ITIL, SAM, and ITAM guide, which also includes information about it. That's the end of the presentation. I trust that this has given you a little bit better insight into the standard. Be very happy to get contacts from many of you or questions for the questions. You can contact me via my website. Thank you very much.